There was a specific metallic stench that began to haunt the hallways of Bellevue Hospital in New York City. During the final days of 1926, it wasn't the smell of cedar or the usual pine of Christmas. It was the sharp, eye-stinging scent of formaldehyde, the chemical used to preserve the dead. But the terrifying part was that this smell was coming from the living. Men and women were stumbling into the emergency rooms, their hands clawing at their stomachs, their voices raspy from internal burns. And then there were their eyes, wide, terrified, and staring into a sudden, irreversible pitch-black darkness. This wasn't a sudden plague. It was a wave of calculated, state-sponsored murder. And it forces me to ask a question that should keep you up tonight. If your government decided that your life was worth less than a political point, would they have the decency to tell you? Or would they just sit back and watch you pour your own execution into a glass? To understand how we got here, we have to pull back the curtain on the noble experiment of Prohibition. By the mid-1920s, the 18th Amendment had turned America into a nation of hypocrites. The law said you couldn't drink, but the heartbeat of every city was the sound of jazz and the clinking of glasses in secret speakeasies. People weren't stopping. They were just getting more desperate. Since real whiskey was hard to find, bootleggers started stealing industrial alcohol, the stuff used in paints, solvents, and fuel. They would hire rogue chemists to wash the poison out and sell it as gin or rye. It was a game of cat and mouse, and for a few years, the people were winning. But in Washington, D.C., the frustration was boiling over. Federal officials were losing face, and they decided that if they couldn't stop the drinking, they would start killing the drinkers. On a cold morning in December 1926, the U.S. Treasury Department issued a secret mandate that would become known as Formulas 5. They didn't just order manufacturers to make the alcohol taste bad. They ordered them to weaponize it. They mandated the addition of lethal toxins, benzene, cadmium, kerosene, and the most devastating of all, 10% methyl alcohol. They knew exactly what methyl alcohol did. They knew that once it hit a human liver, it turned into formic acid, a substance that literally pickles the organs from the inside out and destroys the optic nerve within hours. They didn't put a warning label on the bottles. They didn't go on the radio to warn the public. They simply poisoned the well and waited for the bodies to pile up. The massacre hit its peak during the Christmas holidays. While families were gathering to celebrate, the morgues were filling with people who had simply shared a holiday toast. Dr. Charles Norris, the chief medical examiner of New York City, a man who had seen every kind of horror, stood over the cooling bodies of his fellow citizens in absolute disbelief. He wasn't looking at the victims of a gang war. He was looking at grandmothers, war veterans, and fathers who had been blinded and paralyzed by a chemical cocktail mandated by the very government they paid taxes to. Alongside his brilliant toxicologist, Alexander Gettler, Norris began a desperate crusade. He turned his lab into a war room, cutting open corpses and pulling out the chemical fingerprints of the U.S. Treasury. Norris took his findings to the press his voice shaking with a mix of grief and fury. He called it our national experiment in extermination. He told the world that the United States government was manufacturing death. But the response from the leaders of the Prohibition movement was even more chilling than the poison itself. Wayne Wheeler, the powerful leader of the Anti-Saloon League, didn't offer a single word of sympathy for the dying. Instead, he coldly told the newspapers that anyone who drank illegal alcohol was a deliberate suicide. According to the state, these 10,000 people weren't citizens anymore. They were just collateral damage in a moral crusade. The government didn't stop. They didn't flinch. They continued to poison the alcohol supply for 7 more years until Prohibition was finally repealed in 1933. Think about the sheer weight of that betrayal. It's one thing for a criminal to sell you poison. It's another thing entirely for your protectors to mandate it. By the time the nightmare ended, an estimated 10,000 Americans were dead. Countless others were left blind, their nervous systems shattered, their lives ruined by a government that decided that morality was more important than human pulse. Today, we remember the 1920s for the flappers and the Gatsby parties, but that's just the shiny packaging on a box filled with 10,000 ghosts. This story isn't just a dusty chapter in a history book. It's a haunting reminder of the fragility of the contract between a people and their power. It forces us to realize that when authority loses its humanity, the law becomes a weapon. So, the next time you hear about a necessary sacrifice for the greater good, remember the winter of 1926. Remember the smell of formaldehyde in the hospital wards. And remember that the most dangerous thing you can ever do is assume that the hands holding the scales of justice aren't capable of poisoning the cup. But the horror didn't stop at the hospital doors. While the city was waking up to the news of poisoned whiskey, Dr. Charles Morris was walking into a morgue that felt more like a warehouse for a massacre. He was a man of science, a man who had seen the worst of humanity. But the sight of these victims, their skin unnaturally blue, their eyes cloudy with chemical burns, left him trembling with a cold, sharp fury. Beside him, in a cramped, dimly lit laboratory, was Alexander Gettler. Gettler wasn't just a chemist. He was a pioneer. He was the first man in America to truly understand how to make a dead body tell its secrets. Together, they began to perform autopsies that would change history. They weren't just looking for a cause of death. They were looking for a murder. As Gettler distilled the blood of the victims, the truth bubbled up in his test tubes. It wasn't just bad moonshine. It was a precise industrial-grade cocktail of death. He found traces of benzene, which is used in rubber manufacture, cadmium, a heavy metal that shreds the kidneys, and diethyl phthalate, a substance meant to make plastics flexible. But the most damning evidence was the concentration of methyl alcohol. It was so high that it couldn't have been an accidental byproduct of a poor fermentation process. It was a deliberate addition. The government wasn't just trying to make people sick. They were making sure that if you took more than 2 drinks, you wouldn't live to see the next morning. I want you to think about the psychological terror this created in the streets of New York and Chicago. Imagine being a worker in a factory, coming home after a 12 Because, let's be honest, the wealthy politicians in Washington weren't drinking poisoned industrial alcohol. They had access to high-end smuggled scotch. This poison was designed for the working class, the immigrants, and the people living in the shadows. Dr. Norris decided he couldn't just stay in the basement of the morgue. He became a one-man army against the federal government. He used his own money to publish pamphlets, warning the public exactly which chemicals were being added to the supply. He went to the newspapers and called out the Treasury Department by name. He said, "The government knows that the bootlegger cannot remove these poisons. They know the public will drink them. Therefore, the government is a party to every one of these murders." But for every life Norris tried to save, the prohibitionists fought back with a terrifying zeal. Inside the halls of Congress, some politicians actually cheered when they heard the death toll was rising. They saw it as divine justice. One senator even suggested that the deaths were a cleansing of the weak. This is the part of the story that most history books leave out. The sheer, naked cruelty of a moral crusade gone wrong. The officials in charge of Formula 5 didn't just ignore the deaths. They celebrated them as progress toward a dry America. They had traded their humanity for a law that was clearly failing, and they were willing to stack bodies as high as the Statue of Liberty to prove they were right. By 1927, the death toll had climbed so high that even some of the most hardcore dries began to whisper in horror. But the poisoning didn't stop. It continued for 6 more agonizing years. Every holiday, every celebration, every quiet night at home became a potential funeral. When Prohibition was finally repealed in 1933, the nation didn't just celebrate the return of legal beer. They celebrated the end of a state-sponsored nightmare. Dr. Charles Norris died in 1935, his heart weary from years of fighting a system that didn't care about human life. But his legacy and the memory of those 10,000 souls remains a haunting warning. It tells us that power, when it becomes disconnected from empathy, is the most dangerous poison of all. It reminds us that safety is often the excuse used by those who want to control us. So, the next time you hear a leader talk about harsh measures for the greater good, remember the smell of formaldehyde in the winter of 1926. Remember the blind eyes and the silent graves. Because history doesn't just repeat itself, it waits for us to forget. So it can happen all over again. As we look back at the winter of 1926, we see more than just a failed law or a chemical experiment. We see a mirror reflecting the darkest side of authority. Dr. Charles Norris and Alexander Gettler fought until their last breaths to prove that a citizen's life, no matter their habits or their mistakes, is sacred. They stood against a government that had traded its soul for a political crusade, proving that when the state decides to cleanse its people instead of protecting them, the result is always a graveyard. Prohibition eventually ended, and the poisoned formulas were locked away in the dusty files of history. But the ghosts of those 10,000 souls still haunt the halls of justice today. They remind us that the line between a protector and a predator is paper thin. and it's up to us to make sure that line is never crossed again. Now, as you sit there and think about the smell of formaldehyde and the cold, calculated decisions made in those mahogany offices in Washington, I have one final question for you, and I want you to really dig deep for the answer. If history has shown us that those in power are willing to poison the very well we drink from just to prove a point, who are the real criminals? Is it the man who raised the glass? Or is it the government that secretly filled it with death? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think a government ever has the right to sacrifice its citizens for a greater good? Or was this simply mass murder hidden behind a badge